All mysteries, strange as they may be, can be solved with time. Investigators have solved many puzzles from the past with advanced forensic tools that didn't exist until modern times. Historians have long suspected King Richard III met defeat at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, but the exact location of his body remained a strange mystery for over 500 years. In 2012, while doing research for a true history story, a screenwriter named Philippa Langley believed she knew where the king's remains could be found. This led to an amazing archaeological discovery under a parking lot in England. Human remains were found in the same area where she predicted they would be, leaving experts baffled, and now a forensic investigation was underway to identify the remains were truly his. Some historians believe King Richard III had been smuggled off the battlefield and lived the rest of his days under a different identity. Others speculated that he had succumbed to illness or assassination at a date later than the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. DNA testing soon proved them wrong by establishing the remains did indeed belong to King Richard III. But even so, the mystery behind his final moments was not fully solved. Scientists tried to explain the mystery by performing a full-body scan with modern technology. They found quite a bit of damage had been done to the alleged king, possibly after he fled from the battlefield, but they needed to do more forensic investigating to be sure. There were 11 major blows in total, many to the head, suggesting he had lost his helmet at some point. Other blows were found on his body as well. However, no marks were found on his hands or forearms, suggesting that he was either wearing armor at the time or did not put his hands up to protect himself, possibly delivered after he had already lost his life. Up until this point, exactly what happened to Richard III had been a baffling mystery for centuries. Now, historians are confident that the stories where he met his end while battling opponents on foot were true. Simultaneous angles of impact seemed to indicate that he was surrounded on all sides, quite outnumbered, and that his enemies continued their onslaught for quite some time after his demise. The greatest asteroid impact in recorded history occurred 114 years ago in Siberia, Russia, and with it a strange mystery that went unsolved for many years. The asteroid struck, crushing an estimated 80 million trees across an area of 830 square miles. History stories speak of a giant fireball breaking through a summer sky, a strange blue light comparable to the intensity of the sun itself. A tremendous shock wave also shattered windows and knocked people off their feet hundreds of miles away. And yet it took decades for science experts to explain what had happened. With no debris and, more importantly, no crater ever found, experts were baffled as to how a widespread incident could have left behind no visible trace. Years later, we would finally get an answer to this strange mystery. Scientists now know that the oncoming object did not strike Earth, but rather exploded in the atmosphere, generating what is known as an airburst. Experts further explained the mystery by saying the object was likely a rocky asteroid the size of a 25-story building. The asteroid flew around 33,500 kilometers per hour when it detonated between 3 to 6 miles above Earth. Aside from a lack of evidence, a particularly harsh environment is mostly why it took experts the greater part of the 20th century to figure out the cause of this mysterious event. The first scientists were not able to reach this isolated part of Siberia for over a decade. Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik headed the exploration of the Tunguska blast in 1927, gathering evidence and questioning witnesses. The locals had little more than a series of bizarre stories to share, with some people believing the entire event was an unknown craft from space. The Soviets seemed to think a mini black hole or an antimatter particle was responsible. The true story of the asteroid, however, is just as bizarre, mostly because history has already repeated itself, although on a smaller scale. February 15, 2013, is when Russia experienced a similar real-life horror story with an airburst asteroid in which over 1,000 people reported medical complications from the strange but true event. Oddly enough, trees and buildings were spared from all damage. Using estimated data from the Tunguska incident, scientists were able to determine an asteroid the size of a 5-story skyscraper shattered 15 miles above Earth. While this was much smaller than the Siberian asteroid, which was the size of a 25-story building, this one still produced a 550 kiloton shockwave that shattered over 1 million windows at once. But perhaps the most disturbing mystery of all is the likelihood that this will occur again. According to NASA, a giant asteroid of equally massive proportions is going to burst above the world every 10 to 100 years, and we don't know where. In one of the most bizarre civilization collapses in human history, the Mayans mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind hundreds of towns in the Yucatan Peninsula between 700 and 800 CE. The downfall of one of the most highly developed civilizations has remained one of history's greatest mysteries until recently. Some speculate that they were defeated by an opposing ancient civilization. Another theory is that the ruling elite were overthrown in a peasant rebellion. There are also untold stories about UFOs and alien invasions, however unlikely these tales may be. In a study from Columbia University, however, researchers discovered archaeological evidence that could finally prove this mysterious event. According to them, it wasn't wars, rebellions, or outer space unknowns that caused them to vacate their premises. It was just nature. The study suggests that the Mayans had burnt and cut so much of the forest that it changed weather patterns. With so much cleared land, rain clouds became scarce because there was much less groundwater being evaporated. This caused a massive drought, making it impossible for farmers then to grow crops. Major historical trade routes also changed from land to sea during this time, instantly rendering formerly bustling trade cities pointless and out of the way. Thus, the Mayans were forced to flee to other cities where food, water, and trade were more readily available. If this story is true, then it was mostly environmental changes from rapid expansion which ultimately led to the downfall of the Mayan people. One of the strangest mysteries surrounding Stonehenge, the gigantic prehistoric stone circle built in England around 3000 and 1520 BCE, is the origin of the enormous stones used in their construction. For 400 years, scientists have been attempting, largely without success, to unravel the mystery of where the 23-foot-tall, 22-ton chunks of silcrete, a quartz-rich sedimentary rock, came from. In 2019, researchers got in touch with a man who had worked on a renovation project at Stonehenge in 1958. He gave scientists a stone sample to conduct geochemical experiments with. For the first time in history, scientists were allowed to destroy the historic stone sample and study its core for more precise results. Historians have long speculated that the stones were gathered from nearby, but they were not sure exactly where. After gathering identical stones from 20 other possible sites around southern England for study, they managed to track down the source to the West Woods of Wiltshire. Oddly enough, 2 stones were traced back to Preseli Hills, a location nearly 200 miles away in Wales. But one of the world's greatest unsolved mysteries still remains. How were these gigantic stones carried to the location? We may never know. The mystery of the 2 missing children of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra has been solved. On July 17, 1918, under the orders of Vladimir Lenin, the Tsar and his family were taken downstairs to the basement of their palace to face a firing squad. A strange mystery ensued. 2 children of the assassinated Romanov family and the Grand Duchess Anastasia and her brother Alexei were nowhere to be found. The prevailing theory was that they had survived and escaped after the diamonds sewn into their robes prevented any bullets from penetrating the fabric. However, this still didn't solve the mystery of where they had gone after their escape. Decades later, Jelly Ryabov, a 1970s Russian film director and amateur archaeologist, came one step closer to solving the case by finding an unmarked grave containing 9 individuals. 2 people were believed to be missing from the site. These findings were kept a secret and only became public in 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1997, DNA testing officially proved there was a missing daughter and missing son from the unmarked burial. This gave speculation that the 2 children could have successfully fled and lived on. In 2017, a team of archaeologists solved the mystery when they found a second burial not far from the original location. The 2 inside were identified as children. This discovery, while historically significant, also crushed all hope that Anastasia and her brother had made it out alive. The remains were confirmed a forensic match when samples were compared to DNA taken from a red-splattered shirt worn by Nicholas II during a failed assassination attempt in 1891. With all of the Romanovs identified and accounted for, the mystery was solved, and the true story was now apparent. Anastasia and her brother met their unexpected end with the rest of her family. Miles of mysterious lines adorning the island of Malta have baffled archaeologists and historians for centuries. It's an unexplained mystery going back at least 4,000 years, and modern-day archaeologists seem no closer to the answers than they were in 1647, when their existence was first brought into question. Sometimes referred to as the cart ruts of Malta, these ancient unknown mystery grooves are cut into hard rock and usually found in pairs. Historical experts initially thought they had this mystery solved by suggesting the tracks were caused from transporting heavy cargo on a wheeled cart, or else pulled on a sled. Some of the paths lead to frequently traveled places like temples and trade centers. However, sometimes they went straight into the ocean or even plunging over cliffs. A closer examination of the unexplained events only revealed an even greater historical mystery. Throughout history, archaeologists have found the parallel grooves to be of different depths, and sometimes the lines would draw slightly closer together or further apart, which wheels wouldn't do. Sometimes the grooves were not discovered in pairs at all, leading some history experts to claim these mysteries could not have been made by a cart. Though some claim this mystery has been solved for the most part, the true history behind the weird lines will most likely remain forgotten, along with other untold stories of times past. In 1966, a power station on the Isle of Skye found the exposed ribs of a massive fossilized fish sticking out of a grey rock. Scientists at the National Museum of Scotland found the archaeological discovery to be an amazing story and conjured stories of an untold dinosaur. Since the fossil was deeply embedded in ancient rock, there was no clear way to remove it without causing damage. Citing historical significance, archaeologists obtained permission to extract several tons of rock so that the fossil could be taken whole for study. What they found had a really weird history that still would not be explained until decades later. Amazingly, the fossil was lost in museum storage and sat untouched for over 50 years. No archaeological experts were able to safely extract the fossil until 2016. Scientists verified the 164-million-year-old discovery, dubbed the Storlock Monster, contained an ichthyosaur specimen inside, which was a dolphin-like dinosaur. With this mystery solved, another really weird history story deepens. The discovery and identification of the Storlock Monster, one of the most important fossilized discoveries in Scotland's history, was found just over 100 miles from reports of the Loch Ness Monster. This recent scientific discovery gives new credibility to the unusual story of the Loch Ness Monster, and could possibly be more than just a scary urban legend of Scottish folklore. In 2005, astronomers found themselves utterly fascinated by an amazing discovery in space: a strange mystery planet only 64 light-years outside of our solar system. When NASA scientists examined images of the planet with the Hubble Space Telescope 8 years later in 2013, they were further amazed by a true space mystery they still cannot fully explain. The mysterious planet, known only as HD 189733, was blue and looked remarkably similar to Earth at first glance. Scientists were extremely interested in this mystery and wondered if the mystery blue substance was from the reflection of the water. However, if their data is correct, the true story of this planet makes it not only uninhabitable, but also one of the scariest places in the world. NASA experts think the mystery is not from an ocean of any kind, but rather from clouds containing high levels of salt. Since the planet's atmosphere is almost 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the salt in these clouds hardens into glass. This planet constantly rains glass, and that's just the beginning. In 2015, new tracking equipment from the University of Warwick Astrophysics detected large sodium deposits moving impossibly fast within a cloud formation. In what was the first time a weather system had ever been measured outside of our own, scientists measured wind speeds over 5,400 miles per hour, which is over 7 times the speed of sound. With those kinds of winds, the glass doesn't rain straight down, but rather sideways. This is one of the scariest places that we've ever discovered because it's a scorching hot planet with screaming winds showering glass shards sideways at impossible speeds. Puzzled experts admit that this is all weird science conjecture until they observe the mystery firsthand, which is unlikely to happen anytime soon. In the meantime, stumped astronomers continue to study the untold stories of this peculiar planet out of sheer curiosity alone. In 1990, archaeologists in Griswold, Connecticut made an amazing discovery. Contained within a gravel quarry was a 19th century graveyard where various historical artifacts were excavated. What they found inside a coffin marked JB55 was the biggest mystery of all. Archaeologists deduced that JB stood for this person's age and initials, but they could not explain why they found human remains arranged in a pirate-like skull and crossbones formation. Archaeologists surmised that the contents of this casket had been exhumed and rearranged into a puzzling pirate pattern. Aside from pirates, the weird symbol has been used throughout history as a warning to other vampires. Without a proper name, historians called the man JB, while newspapers ran stories about the historical event known as the Connecticut Vampire. It wasn't until 2019, almost 30 years after this discovery, and more than 200 years after his death, that researchers were able to give the mystery man his name back. Thanks to advances in DNA testing and genetic genealogy, history experts were able to trace the true story back to John Barber, a farmer from times long past. A reconstruction of what he may have looked like was recently released, and although historians are not sure of why he was suspected of being a vampire, they believe their creepy backstory to be a strange but true mystery that's mostly solved. In the 1800s, tuberculosis had a delayed presentation that may have led people to believe that their loved ones were wasting away due to vampirism. Researchers have determined that it was likely such a scenario that led JB55's family to rearrange his remains as a way to prevent him from rising again. The Rosemarkie Caves in northern Scotland were occupied for thousands of years until relatively modern history. In 2015, an archaeological excavation uncovered an amazing and seemingly impossible discovery. Under a thin layer of sand, archaeologists found well-preserved skeletal remains of a historical figure with a secret history that remains largely unknown and shrouded in mystery. The man was found with his legs crossed in a peculiar fashion. Large stones weighed down on his limbs as if to pin him down, and traces of blunt force trauma were found to have been used on the cranium. Who had done this to him and why remains one of history's greatest mysteries that still needs solving. Forensic science determined the man was in his 30s when he passed. His DNA was also a match for those living in the Orkney Islands. Researchers believe he may have been a royal or a chieftain of some kind based on a high-protein diet that was rare for people of this time. Aside from his final moments alive, there was very little wear and tear on his body to suggest a life of combat or hard work. After his unexpected ending, historians believed his body was placed in the cave to give his spirit a passage to the underworld. Whether he was attacked after life as part of a ceremony to keep him from rising again, or as an attack while he was still alive, remains one of the biggest unexplained historical mysteries that researchers still cannot solve. The Nazca region is home to many mysteries brought forth by the civilizations that resided there, such as the Nazca lines and various carvings of geometric imagery. One such mystery is that of the spiraling holes called the pukyas, which are built in the Nazca Desert, situated in southern Peru. The purpose of these strange builds has stumped archaeologists for ages, since the Nazca people didn't leave behind any clues as to when they were built or why. It seems that this peculiar mystery may have finally been solved. From the Italy Institute of Methodologies for Environmental Analysis, Rosa Lassaponara made use of imagery taken from space in order to indicate where these spirals were situated in conjunction with one another, as well as the nearby settlements which appeared to be far easier to date than these pukyas. This method would make it easier to determine how the tunnels were made and what they were used for. The mystery of these random spiral builds was finally solved, and it was determined that the pukyas were a type of hydraulic system that was used to gather water from underground aquifers. This would allow the community to survive the harsh droughts that would fall over the region. Lassaponara stated that these systems were much more developed back when they were first established, and explained that by exploiting the nearby water supply over the years aided in the agriculture of the valley, which was in the most arid and barren places in the world. She also added that a form of specialized technology must have been used in order to achieve the desired effect. These spiraling holes worked by funneling the wind into channels underground. This wind would then force the water from subterranean reservoirs into the areas where it was needed. The water that had been left was stored in pools above the surface. In order to keep the water flowing, long funnel chimneys were dug above the underground canals. These pukyas were of such a great standard and so perfectly constructed that some of them are still functional even today. Lassaponara expressed that in order to build such a large-scale construct, the society must have had an understanding of the specific geology of the area and extensive knowledge of the variations of water supply that would affect the area on a yearly basis. According to Lassaponara, these systems were some of the most ambitious hydraulic constructs in Nazca, which had made water available to the community all year round. This was not only done for agricultural needs, but also for irrigation and domestic needs. The spiral holes were lined with rocks, which were perfectly placed in order to meet the purpose of the system. It was explained that by figuring out the positioning of the spirals in conjunction with water sources, the team of researchers was able to figure out what the system was. A more recent theory has come up regarding the famous Nazca lines found in the Peruvian desert, stating that they may be pointing to the positions of pukyas that are connected to one another. These lines have received a lot of attention throughout the years, and it's possible that they're somehow connected to the pukyas systems and were created by the Nazca civilizations. While they may appear to look simple and primitive, these constructs most likely looked a lot more developed during the time that they were established. Since it was not possible to perform the traditional method of carbon dating, the exact origins of these spiraling holes remains a mystery. The Nazca civilizations also did not have a dedicated writing system, and so no clues could be left behind stating the origins of these tunnels. What is known is that these systems may have been built in the time that the Nazca civilizations occupied the area, between 500 and 200 BC. Thanks to the works of Rosa Lassaponara and her team, as well as satellite imagery, we now know the mystery behind these random spiral tunnels found across the Nazca region. Hopefully, as technology advances, we may be able to solve some of the other mysteries involving the Nazca civilizations. The Odyssey is a poem in 24 books that's credited to the ancient Greek poet Homer. The poem follows the story of Odysseus, who was the king of Ithaca, who had traveled for 10 years trying to get back home after the Trojan War. The poem only covers the final 6 weeks of the journey. Upon his return, Odysseus was recognized by his dog and a nurse. Odysseus' son had assisted him in destroying the suitors of his wife Penelope, and re-established himself in the kingdom. The poem was written in the ancient Greek language, but in the margins of the poem, there were some scribblings in an unidentified language. These annotations remained a mystery up until recent years when they were finally deciphered. The 150-year-old scribblings appeared in 20 pages of Book 2 of a rare 16th century Venetian copy of the Odyssey. The notes appear nonsensical and were left unread for 150 years, written by an unknown author. A competition was held in order to crack the code of the 1504 Venetian edition of the poem, which contained the unknown script which is believed to have been written in the 19th century. The case was solved by an Italian computer engineer named Daniel Mattili, who ultimately won the competition with a prize of $1,000, or £590. The case began when Homer's work from a collector named M.C. Lang donated it to the University of Chicago in 2007, including the 1504 edition with strange annotations written in the margins. Some of the words were also underlined in the poem. It was then that the Special Collections Research Center grabbed the interest of linguists, sleuths, and classicists to translate the strange writing for a prize. He was able to identify that the annotations had been written in a system of shorthand French. 2 runner-ups in the competition had come to the same conclusion. The mysterious notes found in the margins are mostly written in French, which are translations of the Greek words from the Odyssey text. In order to decipher these notes, the pair had assumed that it was written in a French stenography system, which was being used in the 19th century, but the notes were dated as 1854. The two had not been able to line up the notes with many 19th century French shorthand systems until they discovered a chart that compared the system to the tachygraph. They had found 2 French translations of the poem online, one of which was an 1842 publication, and the other an 1854 publication. And so the two began to decode the margin notes. Mattili explained that the system had every consonant and vowel beginning as a shape, and combining them to make new shapes, which would then represent syllables. He also stated that the vertical alignment was rather important, because the position or length of a letter segment may change the entire value. This would account for the underlining of some of the words in the poem, which would be the key to the transcription. One of the notes that were translated read, "whom all the neighboring princes woed." This confirms that the method that Mattili used was in fact the correct one. The author of the notes had underlined specific words and wrote them in shorthand French next to the text. On a few occasions, the translation is initially incorrect, but the writer then corrects these errors, such as mistakenly translating a word as sterile instead of vain. The study of the notes still persists, as the pair are on the journey to discovering who it was that wrote these notes in the margins of the poem. They also wish to find an explanation as to why the annotations and translations are only found in one area of the text. The two have had some additional questions, such as why this particular shorthand was used, since it was not very popular in 1854, but rather at the start of the 19th century. They also wonder how the individual may have come across the shorthand writing, and what their motives may have been. Only part of this mystery has been solved, with many questions left unanswered. At least it's now known what the mysterious scribbles in the margin of the 1504 Venetian copy of the Odyssey are, and so the rest of the mystery can now begin to unravel. This 150-year-old mystery of over a 500-year-old copy of the Odyssey has finally been solved. The unearthing of a strange figure in ancient Egypt led to it being called the Impossible Sculpture. The artifact depicted 2 individuals. One was that of a pharaoh, and the other was another individual. It appears that the pharaoh was seated on the lap of the kneeling individual. The limestone carving shows a pharaoh wearing the blue crown or war crown with an aureus on top. The pharaoh is not shown on a life-size scale in conjunction with the individual. The reason that this piece of art was seen as impossible was because a pharaoh would never be depicted alongside a non-royal person in ancient Egypt. This concept was noted by the curator of the ancient Mediterranean at the National Museums Scotland in Edinburgh, Margaret Maitland, in a paper that was then published in a book called Through the Kaleidoscope. She had also made a post stating that the presence of a non-royal individual alongside a pharaoh was irregular, making it seem as though the sculpture was impossible. Maitland was able to track down where the sculpture came from through archival research. She found that it was excavated at Deir el-Medina, which is a site close to the Valley of the Kings. The mystery of the impossible statue had waited for more than 150 years to be solved. It had been discovered in the 1850s by a team of archaeologists led by a Scottish man named Alexander Henry Ride. The ancient civilizations who lived at Deir el-Medina were the ones in charge of constructing the tombs for pharaohs. This particular statue had taken some damage somewhere along the line, as its face had been destroyed at least 3,000 years prior. Maitland had then made use of other artifacts that were found in the same place, and had also taken to historical records and discovered something unexpected and strange. The senior people of Deir el-Medina were permitted to depict a pharaoh in ways that other people around Egypt were not allowed to. Maitland explained that during the reign of Ramses II, between 1279 and 1213 BC, there was a cult that worshipped statues that had been dedicated to the king at Deir el-Medina. The royals had encouraged the creation of statues depicting the pharaoh, and in order to maintain a stable social structure, these statues and artworks were further encouraged. Although it was usually discouraged to depict a pharaoh along with a non-royal at this particular place and time, it was being condoned. This particular statue is also a depiction of a statue of the pharaoh and not the pharaoh himself, which made it more acceptable at the time. Maitland believes that the pharaoh seen in the statue is actually Ramses II, and the kneeling individual is suspected to be Ramos, who was a senior scribe at the time, as well as the leader of the community. There's a clue found on the figure pointing to Ramos's identity. The individual is adorned with a floral wreath, which is rare for a man to wear in ancient Egypt. Another sculpture found at Deir el-Medina shows a wooden depiction of Ramos wearing the same wreath as in the impossible statue, which may confirm Maitland's suggestion. Not all archaeologists and scientists were on board with this idea, though. Betsy Bryan, who's a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University, who'd not been involved in the research, did agree that the sculpture is a depiction of a man with the pharaoh. She explains that although the pharaoh might be Ramses II, it may more likely be the depiction of Amenhotep I, who reigned from 1525 to 1504 BC. Bryan furthered this by explaining that Amenhotep had been a patron deity of Deir el-Medina and was worshipped as a god, which only happens after a pharaoh has passed away. This meant that if this artifact was made in the period when Ramses II reigned, then the Deir el-Medina civilizations would have depicted a pharaoh that was already deceased, such as Amenhotep I, according to Bryan. Maitland still maintains that the impossible statue may be the representation of Ramses II, as she had previously suggested. In her research, she was able to discover that there were many depictions of viziers and senior officials, along with worshipped pharaohs, who had still been alive at the time that the statues were created. This means that even living pharaohs would occasionally be regarded as a god. Maitland also found that Ramses II was frequently depicted wearing a blue crown, or a war crown in other statues, which further supported her theory. With that, the mystery of the impossible Egyptian statue was finally solved after many years since its unearthing. The name the Tremulous Hand of Worcester was given to an unidentified scribe by historians. This scribe had made annotations on at least 20 Old English manuscripts in the 13th century. It's believed that the individual was a monk, and historians find that the annotations accredited to him had some connection to the Worcester. His annotations had been of translations, which is an indication that he was most likely a linguistic historian. There's something odd about the monk's handwriting, though. It appeared shaky and leftward leaning. It was quite obvious that there was some sort of tremor present in his script, which awarded him the nickname. The individual was a prolific writer who made over 50,000 annotations on various manuscripts. It was initially believed that the tremor was a sign that the writer may be elderly. After a lengthy analysis of the writing, it was determined that this was not the case, and he'd written these notes over a long period. The tremor appeared to worsen over time. The annotations had grabbed the attention of paleographers and even neurologists. Neurologists had been researching neurodegenerative movement disorders, which included Parkinson's, and these annotations were perfect for their study. The initial question asked what type of tremor the monk had exactly. With the help of a historian and a C2D2 research fellow, part of the Department of Economics, Dr. Deborah Thorpe, had been able to solve this long-questioned mystery. Thorpe and a neurologist named Dr. Jane Alty from the Leeds Teaching Hospital NHS Trust had teamed up in order to help us understand this mystery. The study they conducted concluded that the monk was most likely suffering from something known as an essential tremor, a neurological condition which makes the hands shake rhythmically. This condition is said to affect 4 out of 100 adults over the age of 40. This type of tremor becomes noticeable when the affected individual is trying to do something with their hands, such as write. Thorpe supports the idea that the individual was a linguistic expert of the time, and showed a particular interest in older manuscripts involving Old English and Middle English. Thorpe and Atlee examined the tremor using various handwriting samples and charted the progression of the suspected condition. This data was then compared with the handwriting of other individuals from more recent years with different conditions. Thorpe expressed that the Tremulous Hand of Worcester was important because he'd been the only known medieval writer who had a tremor, and a particular interest in translating manuscripts that were made centuries before. The writing had brought about a lot of attention, but this had been the first time that the handwriting had actually been thoroughly investigated with the help of a neurologist and a historian. According to Thorpe, this had been the first time that medieval handwriting had been thoroughly investigated by a neurologist who also had an interest in movement disorders. The study, however, was unable to determine his age or whether he was left or right-handed, but they do believe that the monk had been elderly at the time that he had written this very last manuscript. It's also believed that there's an absence of evidence of cognitive decline, which steers away from the theory of Parkinson's disease and various other neurodegenerative disorders. The research that went into solving the mystery of the Tremulous Hand became a bit more complex than comparing writing samples. A study went into the equipment that the individual used as well as his working conditions. Given the time period, it was likely that a quill was being used to write the annotations. This had been the only writing utensil available in medieval England. It was found that individuals today with essential tremors have their tremors worsened by using a pen of a different grip, size, or weight. If the monk didn't have the option to change his writing utensil, then it would support the idea that the use of a different instrument would not have caused any alterations to his writing. Changes in the handwriting appeared subtle, but at one stage it had appeared that the tremor improved somewhat. It was theorized that perhaps the monk had taken a rest for quite some time before returning to his work. Both neurologists as well as paleographers agree that if this had been the case, then it would support the suggestion of an essential tremor, since recent studies have shown that if individuals affected by the condition take a rest and feel relaxed, then their handwriting shows improvement. Another rather strange theory suggests that perhaps the monk used a small amount of alcohol. It was shown that a very small amount could improve the handwriting of an affected individual. The case of the Tremulous Hand of Worcester appears to be solved according to the scientists involved in the study. It was found what the cause of the strange handwriting was, and suggestions were made as to what may have improved it. Other theories have also been debunked in the process. The Ichthyosaurus is a prehistoric reptile that appears similar in shape to dolphins and sharks, and roamed the seas millions of years ago. This was during the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous eras. The Ichthyosaurus had been one of the very large extinct reptiles that had been brought to the attention of the science world. A paleontologist and honorary scientist at the University of Manchester, Dean Lomax, had been working with Professor Judy Masser from the Brockport College, New York, where they had studied a variety of records dating back hundreds of years to solve a historical mystery. Many of the fossils belonging to the reptile had been discovered in England and throughout the 19th century, though it was only in 1821 that the first Ichthyosaurus species had been described and named the Ichthyosaurus communis. It's become one of the most well-known of all the British fossil reptile species. In 1822, another 3 species were described using the differences in shape as well as the structure of their teeth. 2 of the 3 new species were later re-identified as different types of Ichthyosaurus, and one of them was known as Ichthyosaurus intermedius, which was seen as one more closely related to the first reptile. More scientists, including Sir Richard Owen, the man who created the term dinosaur, had investigated the case of the fossils that were collected from Dorset, Somerset, Yorkshire, and other areas in England. The research conducted on the communis and intermediate species resulted in a mass confusion regarding the Ichthyosaurus. Dean Lomax had explained that the early accounts of the reptile were scrappy and isolated remains, thus resulting in poor understanding of the differences between both suspected species. To make matters worse, the specimen of the communis was lost, and no illustrations of it were made, and so the original specimen of the intermedius but one illustration remains of it. This has proven problematic for scientists in determining the differences between the species. Then, in the 1970s, a paleontologist named Dr. Chris McGowan had been the first scientist to suggest that the communis and intermedius were the same species. McGowan could not find any evidence supporting that these were two different species. Subsequently, an extensive investigation was pursued and all of the research ever conducted on the Ichthyosaurus was reviewed. It was confirmed that the species were in fact the same, and features of intermedius can be found in other Ichthyosaurus species, which also includes the communis. The two extinct reptilian species were found to be the exact same species, lessening the confusion among scientists. In addition to this now solved mystery, there was another incident involving the Ichthyosaurus that appeared when archaeologists unearthed 7 large reptiles in the same area, belonging to the Ichthyosaurus shonisaurus. A theory has recently come up suggesting a solution behind the mystery as to why these creatures were found in this area in abundance, appearing as a mass graveyard. Through some extensive research, it was found that these remains were of adult Ichthyosaurus, who were returning to these waters in order to give birth. The remains did appear out of place according to scientists. After some time, they were able to determine that these reptiles would do their hunting and general living elsewhere before returning to these warm waters to spawn. The reason as to why so many of them perished in one area and became buried remains unclear for the time being. The hypothesis of the paleontologists regarding the migratory behavior of these creatures is correct, and the shonisaurus would find themselves back in these warm waters to give birth to young Ichthyosaurus. So, 2 mysteries involving the Ichthyosaurus had been solved after ages of unanswered questions and much confusion. The ocean is undoubtedly one of the most mysterious places on Earth, as we've only mapped around 20% of it and explored just 5% of its vast expanse. There's no telling what creatures we're yet to discover, especially in the deepest parts of the ocean, such as an area known as Challenger Deep in the Pacific Ocean, which makes up part of the Mariana Trench. New discoveries are being made in the sea on a near daily basis, as we continue to explore its many unknown regions. And though we are gaining a better understanding of what lies beneath the waters, people who lived long ago were often baffled by what they saw while traveling across the ocean, some even being wary of sea monsters that they believed could swallow a ship whole if it wanted to. One such incident occurred in January of 1864, when the CSS Alabama, a Confederate warship, was sailing around the Horn of Africa while the Civil War was raging on in the US. The USS Alabama was just one of a fleet of ships, the aim of which was to attack any merchant ships owned by the Union that it came across, thereby impairing international trading that would aid enemy forces. But on the 30th of January, the ship encountered something that remained unexplained for many years, and that startled the ship's captain, Raphael Sims. He noted that on that night there was no moon in the sky, and they could see the stars sprawled across the sky above them. At around 8 p.m. that evening, he and his crew noticed something strange about the water ahead of this ship, as it changed from the usual deep blue color to an almost brilliant white that left them startled and confused. They immediately started fearing that the ship would run aground, as they assumed the change of color was due to a ridge that had become visible under the waves, and so they decided to lower a weighted line to see how deep the water was. They then knew that they had nothing to fear from the sea floor, as the line weight reached 600 feet in depth without ever touching the bottom. In his diary, Sims recalled the event, stating, quote, "Around the horizon, there was a subdued glare or flush, as though there was a distant illumination going on, while overhead there was a lurid dark sky." He added that if there were any other ships in the vicinity, its crew would surely have thought that the CSS Alabama was a ghost ship, as it too was being illuminated by the strange white water. For the next few hours, the ship continued through the strange patch of water, but they emerged on the other side unscathed, still completely baffled by what they had experienced, with no plausible explanation. Sims's diary contains some of the earliest accounts of this phenomenon. It's been seen by many other sailors in different parts of the ocean over the years, and until now, we had no idea what caused it. Sims didn't know it at the time, but his account of the Milky Sea that he and his crew encountered that night is seen as a major contribution to studies being performed today, in an effort to explain what causes these seemingly unearthly glows in the ocean that's left many a sailor either terrified or scratching their head. You may think that these studies are superfluous, as most people know that glows in the ocean are caused by bioluminescent creatures, with an ability similar to the glow that we see in creatures on dry land, including fireflies, glowworms, and some wood-boring insects. But these creatures typically emit a glow that's tinted either green or blue, not brilliantly white as was reported by Sims and his men. Furthermore, typical bioluminescence is usually observed as pulsating with light, rather than glowing steadily as it did on that night. Some sailors used to believe that if their ship was to sail into one of these patches of Milky Sea, it pointed to a disastrous event that was sure to happen in the near future, and that it was to be avoided at all costs, while others believe its existence was nothing more than mere fanciful thinking. The first proper study of this phenomenon came about purely by chance when a US Navy research ship was sailing along the Arabian Peninsula in 1985. The researchers aboard were in the process of studying other bioluminescent creatures when they encountered a similar Milky Sea, and they immediately sprang into action. After collecting samples from the water, they found the usual culprits: plankton, creatures known as dinoflagellates, and copepods. But these wouldn't account for the white water that they were seeing, as these creatures emitted the usual blue-hued glow. Digging a little further, they discovered that their samples also contained bacteria that seemed to have bioluminescent qualities, and they suspected that algae colonies that lived on the water's surface rupture when they die. They suggested that this released lipids that are then eaten by the bacteria, causing them to shine with continuous white bioluminescence. The US Navy took a particular interest in this research, since a bright white ocean could easily give away the position of one of its submarines, making it vulnerable to enemy attack. But there was no way of knowing when one of these bright patches may appear, and so researchers started searching for a way to detect them earlier. Atmospheric scientist Stephen Miller, who worked at a California Naval Research Laboratory during the early 2000s, speculated that it may be easier to see these patches from above with the use of satellite sensors. He found an account from the SS Lima, a British merchant ship that sailed through a Milky Sea in January of 1995, also along the Horn of Africa. This patch of glowing water was so massive that the ship's captain described it as stretching from horizon to horizon, covering the entire ocean in front of the ship and the waters around it. Miller looked at historical images captured by the Operational Line Scan system, which is connected to US Air Force satellites. At first, he thought that it hadn't captured anything, but when he zoomed in on the area in question, he noticed a small section of glowing ocean. It had now been determined that large patches of bioluminescence are visible from space, and for the next step, Miller started working with Stephen Haddock from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, as he'd been studying mainly bioluminescent jellyfish for some time. They're now hopeful that when these patches are spotted from space, research crews can quickly be dispatched to study them in the water and to collect samples. There are still some unanswered questions about this strange bacteria, but thanks to Miller and Haddock's efforts, we're getting ever closer to understanding them better, and some good progress has been made in understanding how they differ from other bioluminescent creatures. Archaeology has to be one of the most interesting professions in the world, as archaeologists are constantly unearthing relics, writings, and buildings from ancient times, and learning how the people who were alive during those times survived on a day-to-day basis. But sometimes when these items are discovered, they leave researchers completely baffled. either because they don't understand what a certain relic was used for, how it ended up in the area where it was found, or who it belonged to. One such mystery concerns a 13th century man, believed to have been a monk, who had a very unique writing style. When some of his writings were discovered, it was noted that he likely had a tremor in his hands, but the cause remained a mystery. Just as strange is the fact that he was in the habit of translating documents that had been written much earlier, in some cases centuries before he lived, but no one knows why he would have chosen to do so. The monk has since earned the moniker the Tremulous Hand of Worcester, and his writings are now being studied by experts, not only from a historical point of view, but also a medical one, as it's believed that he suffered from a condition known as essential tremor. This condition causes the sufferer to shake involuntarily, and usually in a rhythmic fashion. It can affect pretty much any part of the body, but it's far more common for the tremors to affect the hands, and they typically get worse when the sufferer attempts a task such as tying a knot or lifting a cup to their lips. Although the monk's writings have been found in at least 20 books that he contributed to, he never once spoke about the condition that caused him to have a tremor in his hand, and so there's no easy way of finding out what caused it. Now, researchers are using samples of his handwriting and comparing them to each other to determine if his tremor got worse as time went by. The severity of his tremor would then be classified as either fine or fine moderate, depending on how badly it affected his handwriting. Once this was done, the same samples would be compared to handwriting samples of someone who suffers from a tremor in modern times while using a calligraphy pen. But this doesn't mean that finding the cause of this tremor would be easy, as there are many factors to consider. Literary scholar Christine Franzen has studied the monk's case closely and shared her findings with the rest of the world. She noticed that on some of the pages that he wrote, he made notes in the margins about specific medical conditions, including ocular problems and urinary ailments. It was thought that this may have been due to his own condition, since bladder stones were far more common during medieval times, especially among those who had occupations such as writing, where they wouldn't move around as much as they should, just as the monk would have done. Furthermore, it's known that when someone is diagnosed with both bladder stones and a tremor, there's a chance that they're suffering from Parkinson's disease. And when it was noted that the monk's handwriting became bigger during the last pieces that he wrote, it was thought that the monk was struggling to see properly. He also made notes pertaining to spasms, which may further support the theory that he was suffering from Parkinson's, though it may point to something as simple as writer's cramp. Other ailments that he showed an interest in included nosebleeds, warts, and earaches, but there's no way of knowing whether he suffered from any of these, or if he was just interested in what caused them and how they could be treated. Another factor that needed to be considered was whether the monk had enough sleep. In some instances, he would write a few lines and it's clear that he then took a break, since the lines that followed the first are written with a much steadier hand. When the monk's earlier writings were compared with later documents, Franzen noted that his earlier Middle English writing was neat, upright, and didn't have any indication that he was suffering from any kind of tremor. But in his later writings, which were mostly done in Latin, the letters begin to lean to the left, and it becomes obvious that he was now really struggling to keep the tremor under control. Although some errors were made in his earlier work and then corrected later, Franzen doesn't think that this has anything to do with his physical condition, but rather chalked it up to his inexperience at the time. Franzen was able to establish that the monk likely didn't suffer from Parkinson's, since people who suffer from this condition usually write erratically, which wasn't observed in the monk's writings. It's also been suggested that the monk suffered from a form of congenital tremor, as is often noted in patients suffering from this condition, that their handwriting starts to lean to the left, as was the case as the monk got older. Some people suggested that the tremor may simply have been caused by the monk getting older, but Franzen doesn't think that this is the case, since personal letters that he wrote show no indication that he was elderly. This would then suggest that the tremor wasn't caused by any type of mental deterioration. But there is no doubt that his tremor became more exaggerated as he got older, as his handwriting deteriorated from fine to fine moderate as he was aging. Studies have shown that people with tremors see a 0.08 increase in their tremors with each passing year, so this would be consistent with the monk's ever-worsening handwriting. As for the fact that the monk's handwriting suddenly improved after he took a break from writing, It's been suggested that he either received some sort of treatment, which could be something as simple as relaxing for a while, or that he consumed alcohol during that time, which may have helped. When the monk's handwriting was compared to that of a right-handed man suffering from essential tremors, they were found to be remarkably similar. Their letters seemed to lean in the same direction, especially in the monk's later writings. Since no solid evidence could be found that the scribe was merely suffering from something as simple as writer's cramp, it's almost certain that he was struggling with essential tremor, since this is a far more common affliction than any other type of tremor. Although he did show a marked interest in bladder and eye ailments, it isn't to say that he suffered from any of these conditions, since he may simply have been interested in their causes. Even if he was suffering from either one of these conditions, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're connected to his tremor, but were likely separate issues that he had to deal with. The monk's identity remains a mystery to this day, but his writings continue to fascinate scholars all over the world and will likely do so for a long time to come. Long-distance runners have an ability that most of us would love to have: the stamina to cover great distances at a trot, and being able to repeat that feat whenever necessary. These days, this type of running is mostly reserved for marathons and other athletic competitions. But in times past, it was a skill that could change the course of history. One famous account, regarded by many people to be the greatest run ever completed, occurred after the Battle of Marathon, which was being fought between Greece and Persia in 490 BC. An unnamed messenger ran a full 26 miles from the site of the battle to Athens, where he relayed news of the Greeks' victory over the Persians. But as soon as he delivered the good news, he collapsed and passed away from pure exhaustion. That's the way the story's told anyway. And now, scholars have decided to look into this account a little more closely, to determine whether this version of events is true or even plausible. It should be noted that this runner wasn't just a normal citizen with a passion for long-distance running. He was known as Hemerodromos, a long-distance runner that served in the Greek military. These runners were often dogged in their task, often covering distances thought to be impossible before, and often covering miles on terrain that would have been rocky and very hard to negotiate. They would often go without sleep for extended periods of time, and since they were so dedicated to their duty, they were considered to be more than mere runners and almost thought of as sacred. Running 26 miles is not that impressive by the standards of today's long-distance athletes. But what many people don't know about the Battle of Marathon is that this athlete's great run was preceded by at least two others of considerable distance, performed by a man known as Phidippides. The first of these runs was made from Athens in Greece to Sparta, where Phidippides was sent to try and gather more troops to aid the Greek army. It's likely that he would recharge his energy along the way by eating figs, dried meats, honey, and sesame seeds, which would have been very necessary since he needed to cover as many as 150 miles. It would take him 2 days to cover the distance to Sparta, and it's likely that he never slept until he reached his intended destination. When he did so, he was completely exhausted, but he still needed to plead his case to the Spartans, which he did by stating, quote, "Men of Sparta, the Athenians beseech you to hasten to their aid, and not allow that state, which is the most ancient in all of Greece, to be enslaved by the barbarians." He had made a compelling argument, but aid would not come immediately, since the Spartans believed that the gods would not allow them to fight until the next full moon, which was still 6 days away. Knowing that his fellow soldiers were awaiting aid from the Spartans, Phidippides had to somehow get word to them that there would be a considerable delay, and so he ate, slept through the night, and started on the return journey, setting off early the next morning. But unsurprisingly, he found the going tough, and by the time he reached Mount Parthenion, he was struggling. This is when something inexplicable happened. He had a vision of the Greek god Pan, who looks like a human, with the exception that he has goat's horns on his head. Being a Greek god, Pan told Phidippides that he was supportive of his fellow soldiers' plight, but that he had to let them know that he would only remain loyal to them if they worshipped him correctly. If this was done, he would pass his powers on to the fighting soldiers, ensuring that they would be victorious over the Persians. Phidippides was exhausted though, and he decided a nap was in order before setting off once more. He kept good pace once again and reached Athens in 2 days, but the city was in trouble as 60,000 Persians were advancing towards it. It was then decided that 10,000 Athenians would be sent to Marathon which was about 25 miles away to ward off as many enemy soldiers as possible. Upon their arrival, they stood their ground awaiting the enemy's attack, but the general soon got word that the Persians had returned to their ships and were planning on sending 2 separate groups of soldiers in an effort to surround them. Most of the soldiers suggested making the trek back to the city to wait for the arrival of the Spartans, but Pheidippides informed them that the Spartans would only be joining the fray later on, thanks to their religious beliefs. And so the decision was made to launch a surprise attack on the Persians early the next morning, before they could depart to surround the Greek soldiers. The plan worked, and the Greek army rejoiced in the fact that they had bested their Persian enemies on dry land for the first time in history. The Spartans would eventually arrive in Athens, only to find out that the battle had been waged and won without their help. Following this tremendous victory, another runner was sent back to Athens from the site of the battle to deliver the good news. It's said that when he arrived, he yelled, "Rejoice, we conquer," after which he fell to the ground deceased. But scholars have always been skeptical of this tale, since the distance that the runner covered should not have been too hard for him to complete, prompting them to take a closer look at the conditions that he had to endure during the run. Most historians will state that the Battle of Marathon took place on the 12th of September, 490 BC, in fair weather conditions given the time of year. This is thanks to notes made by a Greek historian named Herodotus, but it seems there may have been a flaw in his calculations. The Spartans delayed their aid to the Greeks because they were in the middle of a religious celebration, which was set to last until the next full moon. Dates of the festival were used to determine the date of the battle, but failed to take into account that the Spartans used their own calendar. The problem comes from the fact that the beginning of the year differed greatly between the Athenian and Spartan calendars. The Athenian year started on the first full moon after the summer solstice, whereas the Spartan year started on the first full moon after the autumn equinox. This would mean that the Greek calendar was 1 month behind that of the Spartans, which suggests that the battle actually took place on the 12th of August instead. Conditions would have been quite different for the runner, as it would have been much hotter, making it likely that he overexerted himself and collapsed due to exhaustion, leading to his demise. But there are some scholars who believe the run never took place at all, though it's impossible to prove one way or the other. Most people around the world know that Abraham Lincoln served as the 16th President of the United States in March of 1861 to April of 1865, but not everyone is aware that he had a career as a lawyer before he decided to go into politics, and one trial that he was a part of is still spoken about today. It all started in 1857 when Peter Cartwright, a preacher in Virgin's Grove, Illinois, decided to conduct a church revival in the area, and the news was well received as people flocked to his sermons from far and wide. Most of the people in attendance were there to pray, sing religious songs, read from the Bible, and listen to Cartwright's words of wisdom, while others saw it as an opportunity to partake in a few alcoholic beverages. On the 29th of August, many people noted as they left Cartwright's tent that it was a clear night with a brightly shining moon that seemed to bathe the tent in an even more brilliant white. But the sermon had concluded, and everyone in attendance started making their way home. Some of those who still felt like a few more drinks headed to a local saloon, the proprietor of which was a man by the name of Tom Steele. But things took a violent turn when 2 men, William Duff Armstrong and James Norris, got into a heated argument with a man named Metzger, and the argument soon turned physical. The 2 men got the better of Metzger, who thought it would be better to flee, and he did so, making his way to a friend's house. But Armstrong and Norris had done more damage than they realized, as Metzger passed away 3 days later from injuries sustained to his head during the altercation. Both men were swiftly taken into custody and charged with Metzger's passing. Norris would be the first to stand trial, and he would ultimately be found guilty, after which he would spend 6 years behind bars. But Armstrong had no intention of going to jail, and he asked his mother Hannah to travel to Springfield to ask for the aid of one of their family friends, which was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was happy to take the case and told Armstrong that he would do so free of charge. The trial was to be held in Beardstown, Illinois, and on the 7th of May the following year, it began. But most people thought that Armstrong didn't have much of a defense, especially since Norris was already in prison for the same crime. Further compounding Armstrong's chances was the fact that there was an eyewitness, a man named Charles Allen, who testified that he saw the brawl occur about 150 yards from where he was that night at around 11 p.m., though some sources list the time as just before midnight. He added that Armstrong was armed with a slungshot, which is a leather strip with a weight attached to one end, and that he used it to strike the victim in the back of the head. This would certainly be enough to inflict the type of damage that led to Metzger's death, but Lincoln had other ideas. He asserted that Allen couldn't possibly have seen Armstrong during the fight, since it was late at night and he was standing some distance away from all the three men. Allen stated that since it was a full moon, he actually had a good view of the fight, and that he was certain it was Armstrong who delivered the blow. This is when Lincoln put his plan into action. He brought out an 1857 calendar and turned to the jury to point out that, according to the calendar, the moon was only 74% full, and at the time the fight took place, was just about to set below the horizon. He argued that it would have been impossible for Allen to see who was involved in the fight, since the moon would have provided very little, if any, light. He added that Allen either mistook another man for Armstrong, or that he had fabricated his version of events. He then turned to the judge and asked him to take judicial notice of the fact that the moon was about to set, meaning that the jury would have to make up their own minds as to what they believed based on the scientific evidence that they'd been presented with. They had no choice but to agree with these facts, and Armstrong was set free. The trial has since become known as the Almanac Trial, but many historians have questions about Lincoln's methods that day, as they believe he may have acted underhandedly. Many people think that he may have used a fake calendar to win his case, but this is almost certainly not true because of what transpired in the courtroom. Lincoln didn't just pass one calendar around, but provided one to the judge, one to the prosecutor, and another to the jury. Furthermore, after he had made his claim, the judge ordered that a few more copies of the calendar be bought and brought to the courtroom. The copies that were then bought were printed by an entirely different company, and they seemed to confirm Lincoln's argument. But soon after the trial was over, people were still discussing the events that transpired in the courtroom. As most of us would do, they took a closer look at the calendar and started to notice something strange: the fact that Lincoln was simply wrong. The calendar showed that there was indeed a full moon that night, and it would have been in a position in the sky that would have provided more than enough light for Allen to identify Metzger's two attackers. This gave rise to the theory that he had used a fake calendar, but it seems the reality is that he merely planted the idea of there being insufficient light in the judge, jury, prosecution, and even the eyewitnesses' minds. It should be noted that during his closing statements, Lincoln made sure to mention that the Armstrong family wasn't only known to him, but that he held them in high regard, which could have easily altered the jury's perception of Armstrong's true nature. He also called another witness, who stated that the so-called slungshot that was said to have been used during the attack didn't even belong to Armstrong, as it was actually his. Many people still maintain that Lincoln acted unethically during Armstrong's trial, and while this may be true, it's now been proven once and for all that he didn't use a fake calendar, but likely rather outwitted everyone present in the courtroom that day. There's no doubt that Vincent van Gogh is still regarded today as one of the greatest and most gifted artists that ever lived. But one of the best known facts about him, even among those who don't have a particular interest in the art world, is that he cut his own ear off as a gift to a woman. Though no one is certain who the woman was or how much of his ear he actually gifted her, these are questions that have always stuck in the mind of 58-year-old Bernadette Murphy, a teacher who in 2009 lived in a town just a few hours away from where Van Gogh decided to cut his ear off, and where he completed almost 200 of his paintings. She'd visited the area many times before with her family, and thinks that this is likely why these questions always nagged at her. She recalls that whenever she overheard a tour guide talking about Van Gogh, they would say that he only cut the bottom part of his earlobe off, but a short while later, another guide would tell their group that he had, in fact, removed the entire ear, and she wanted to know what really happened. What is known is that in the weeks leading up to the incident, many people noted that Van Gogh was acting strangely and out of character. His behavior got so bad that the man who shared his house, Paul, decided to leave after spending just 2 months in his company. The ear slicing incident is thought to have come about after Van Gogh received a letter from his brother, in which he informed him that he had gotten engaged. This sent Van Gogh into a downward spiral, as he believed he would lose the financial assistance that his brother had been providing, and they would have far less contact with him after he got married. Many people believe that this had a profound effect on his emotional state, and that this was the incident that led to him cutting his ear off, coupled with his love for the woman to whom he gifted it. In 2009, Murphy had the opportunity to spend some time trying to solve this mystery, as she had to take time off from her teaching job due to health issues. As she delved further into the incident, she would eventually quit her teaching job completely and spend the next 7 years trying to throw light on the mystery, eventually publishing a book called Van Gogh's Ear. She stated that she approached the task in the same way a cold case detective would, by starting from the very beginning. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to go by, as she could only find one press article about the incident. There were many conflicting accounts. Some people stated that Van Gogh wasn't actually the one who did the cutting, and that it was his housemate, Paul, who cut his ear off with a sword while they were in the midst of an argument. But the most common tale is that he did it himself with the use of a razor, and Murphy found corroborating evidence for this when she discovered 4 more articles about the strange incident. Most people didn't know that these articles existed, since Van Gogh was in the habit of signing his paintings as Vincent, because French-speaking locals struggled to pronounce his surname. These articles merely named the artist as Vincent, and so were completely overlooked. She was unable to find a police report on the incident and couldn't even find any records showing that he had rented the house that he was living in at the time. But she did have a history in genealogy, as she traced her own ancestry years earlier, and she decided that this would be a good place to start. She then collected data on all the people who lived in the same neighborhood as Van Gogh at the time, and ended up with a list of around 15,000 names. She then employed an architect to help her structure a map of Arles as it was before the Second World War, as much of the city had been damaged and rebuilt. She had now created a solid foundation to work from, and she started reading through a massive amount of documents to learn as much about the painter as she could. And it was during this process that she made the most telling discovery. While pursuing the archives of author Irving Stone, who wrote the book Lust for Life, a fictional biography on Van Gogh, she came across an article that was published by Life magazine in 1955, in which it stated that Van Gogh had cut his whole ear off. But also included in the archive was a letter from a Life reader who contested this fact, stating that he had only cut a section of his ear off. The magazine's editors then wrote back, including a diagram in their response, which was drawn by Felix Ray, the first person to see Van Gogh upon his arrival at the hospital following the event. But sadly, the diagram was nowhere to be found. She then reached out to Irving Stone's archivist to ask him whether he knew about the diagram, which he didn't, but he agreed to do some digging despite the fact that he was certain it wasn't among the documents he had. But quite unbelievably, she only had to wait a few hours to get a reply. When she woke up the next morning, she saw an email from the archivist stating that he had found what she was looking for. The diagram was drawn on a doctor's prescription pad and had not one, but 2 diagrams showing how the painter had cut his ear off and how he had removed all but the lobe. This part of the mystery had finally been solved, but there was still the matter of the identity of the woman who he then gave it to. All that was known at this point was that the woman's name was Rachel, and it had always been assumed that she was a street worker. But Murphy could find no records of a street worker by that name, but did find one press article that named the woman as Gabby instead. She managed to track the woman's family down, and they told her that Gabby wasn't a street worker, but actually worked at a brothel as a maid. It's now been speculated that Van Gogh and Gabby met each other earlier in Paris while she was undergoing treatment for rabies after she was bitten by a dog, but this is yet to be fully proven. As for the mystery of Van Gogh's ear, it has been solved beyond a shadow of a doubt, thanks to the dogged efforts of a schoolteacher. For centuries, the mystery behind the lost army of Cambyses II has baffled historians and archaeologists alike, but now it seems that the fate of these soldiers has finally been explained. Cambyses II was the son of Cyrus the Great. In 524 BC, Cambyses sent an army of 50,000 soldiers to destroy the oracle of Amen, a medium that served the god Amen. The army entered the desert in Egypt, but during their trek, something went terribly wrong, and they were never seen or heard from again. Speculation ran rife as to what had become of the army, but the Greek historian Herodotus decided on a theory that has been debated ever since. Herodotus speculated that the entire army had encountered a sandstorm so massive that it buried all 50,000 men in the desert. As unlikely as that sounds, no one has ever been able to offer a better explanation for the army's sudden disappearance. Until now, that is. Professor Olaf Kaper, an Egyptologist in the Netherlands, has always been uncomfortable with Herodotus's explanation, and he states that it has long been known that a person cannot simply be buried alive by a sandstorm. He adds that his research has shown that the army was, in fact, marching to the Dakhla oasis, where they were planning to confront the enemy army of Pettibastus III. But before they could reach their destination, they were ambushed by Pettibastus's men and defeated. Kaper also believes that the sandstorm theory came to be thanks to King Darius I, who manipulated his people's belief toward the sandstorm theory. When Herodotus wrote his theory 75 years later, all he had to go by was Darius's account, and so the mystery was born. Kaper's findings came about when he deciphered Pettibastus III's full titles on ancient temple blocks, and they showed that there was indeed a stronghold at the Dakhla oasis at the beginning of the Persian period. When that was added to the already acquired knowledge of Pettibastus III, they were able to reconstruct the events that wiped out the army, and the mystery was finally solved. The historical mystery involving Jean-François de Galop de la Perouse, a French naval officer and explorer, began in 1785, but the mystery of his disappearance has now finally been explained. During that time, King Louis XVI had heard of the success of Captain James Cook's explorations in the Pacific, and he wanted to prove to the world that France could be a force to be reckoned with as far as ocean exploration was concerned. And so he ordered de la Perouse to undertake a voyage to explore North and South America and Asia, with sponsorships from the king himself. De la Perouse was given 2 ships, and in August of 1785 he headed out to sea. The voyage was expected to return 4 years later, and first they sailed around Cape Horn. As they mapped coastlines and explored previously uncharted parts of the sea, de la Perouse sent back regular reports on his progress. 3 years later, in January of 1788, they arrived in Botany Bay in Australia, where they remained until March. As they set sail once more, the ships were seen by a British lookout, but that would be the last sighting ever recorded. When no further reports were received from de la Perouse, and he didn't return by 1791, the French government sent a search party to try and locate the 2 ships, but their efforts were futile. The ships and their passengers were never found, and de la Perouse became part of an unsolved historical mystery. Then in 1826, Irish captain Peter Dillon bought several swords while he was traveling in the Santa Cruz Islands. He believed that they belonged to de la Perouse, and locals informed him that the swords came from a small island nearby, where 2 ships had broken up. Here, Dillon found anchors and other parts of wreckage that were eventually proven to have belonged to both of the ships the men had been traveling on. This theory was bolstered in 1964 when a shipwreck was found and it was formally identified by another expedition in 2005. A final voyage was undertaken in 2008 using technological resources that had not been available previously. It was determined that after the 2 ships had wrecked, the men had their lives ended by local inhabitants. King Tut, the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, who ruled from 1332 BC until his passing in 1323, was buried with 2 daggers, one of which proved to be a true unsolved historical mystery upon its discovery in 1925. King Tut's reign wasn't one of significance, but when his tomb was unearthed in 1922, the treasure trove within ensured that he became one of the most well-known pharaohs in history. But among the jewelry, musical instruments, and other priceless artifacts, 2 daggers were found, one of which seemed out of place. The first was almost entirely made of gold, as would be expected for a pharaoh, but the other was seemingly made of iron, a metal that the Egyptians were still unfamiliar with, since they were still living in the Bronze Age, and no proof has been found that they used iron in smelting until the 6th century BC. But analysis done in 2016 using an X-ray fluorescent spectrometer showed that the blade was made up mostly of iron, but it also contained 11% nickel and 0.6% cobalt, indicating that it was constructed from a meteorite. The golden dagger that was found was crudely constructed when compared to the expert craftsmanship of the more ornate iron blade. This would seem to suggest that it had been imported to Egypt, likely as a gift from someone living in a neighboring territory. And so, thanks to modern technology, the mystery of King Tut's strange dagger has finally been solved, and it can be seen at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it's been kept on display. On the 30th of December in 620 AD, people in Japan experienced a phenomenon that they described as a red sign, a streak of red light that appeared in the sky. And for the next millennium and a half, it remained an unsolved part of weird history. The light was considered at the time to be a bad omen, described by witnesses as comparable to the red fanned tail feathers of a pheasant, leaving scholars baffled as to what the phenomenon was that they saw. But thanks to researchers from the Graduate University for Advanced Studies in Japan, an explanation has finally been found. One researcher states that many people believed it to actually have been an aurora. The problem with that theory, however, was that auroras don't typically look like the tail feathers of a pheasant, but rather present themselves as ribbons that wave across the sky, like the famous aurora borealis. Another theory that was put forward was that it may have been a passing comet, but comets don't typically appear red in color. And so they decided to take a different approach to the problem, adjusting for the fact that Japan sat at 33 degrees in magnetic latitude when the light was observed, as opposed to the 25 degrees that it sits at today. They added to that the fact that the pheasant's tail was approximately 10 degrees long, and it became clear that it was situated well within an area that was affected by a strong magnetic storm at the time. Since it was recently discovered that auroras often appear in the shape of a pheasant's tail during magnetic storms, it is extremely likely that the witnesses had actually seen an aurora in the sky above them. In Japan, pheasants are considered the messengers of heaven, and since the aurora appeared in the sky, and in that particular shape, it's understandable that the heavenly phenomenon was described in such a way. In 1853, a man working as a gum sapper in Guatemala stumbled upon the ruins of the city of Tikal that had remained undiscovered for over 1,000 years, and with it came a historical mystery that remained unsolved until 2020. The city is located in northern Guatemala, and at its peak, it was the capital of one of the most powerful Mayan kingdoms. However, the only water that was available to its people was whatever was collected when it rained, and stored 10 reservoirs throughout the city, since there was no access to any lakes or rivers. But by 950, Tikal was a deserted city, with only a few people living in makeshift huts throughout the ruins. The reason for the abandonment of the city was a mystery that baffled archaeologists and anthropologists for more than a century. But thanks to researchers from the University of Cincinnati, an explanation has finally been found. The Mayans were known to mine cinnabar to create a red powder that was used as a dye. It was found to be present in the interiors of almost all high-status burial chambers in the city, with one grave containing as much as 20 pounds of cinnabar. It was also used in temples and the main palace, signifying that they were areas of high importance. But as heavy rainfall hit the area, dangerous amounts of powder seeped into the funnels that were created to supply the water reservoirs, poisoning the water that the Mayan people relied on so heavily. This would not only have affected their drinking water, but it also would have been present in food that had been cooked in the water. Added to this, researchers found toxin-producing green algae at the bottom of the reservoirs, further adding to the Mayan people's problems. It was found that during the 800s, the two central reservoirs were affected by phosphate, which blue-green algae need to survive and flourish, This was caused by cooking fires around the reservoirs, as well as the ceramic plates that were used and then washed in the reservoirs, adding organic material to the water. It was also discovered that a trash heap containing food waste was located so close to one of the reservoirs that heavy rains would cause runoff to enter the reservoir, and when the algae finally bloomed, the water became impotable. This would have been a catastrophic turn of events that was further exacerbated by the fact that the region experienced a drought between 820 and 870. Research shows that the sediment in which the blue-green algae and mercuric sulfide were found corresponds with this time frame. These factors combined meant that the Mayan people were out of options as far as drinking water and food supplies were concerned, and they had no other option but to abandon the city that had stood proudly for over 1,000 years. And so the mystery was solved. Researchers now intend to carry out similar tests at other Mayan settlements to determine whether they also suffered from a similar fate. When an Indian Airlines Caravela jet crashed onto the tarmac of Bombay's Santa Cruz Airport on October 12, 1976, the family of Sajid Thungal feared the worst. The flight had been scheduled to go from the city now known as Mumbai to Madras, but the engine fire caused the plane to crash. All 95 people aboard lost their lives. Due to the state of the remains after the crash, it was impossible to confirm whether he was one of the victims. Sajid's brother flew to Abu Dhabi, where Sajid had been working, to search for him in the hope that he might not have been on the flight. He took a photo and asked around, but nobody had seen it. For the next 45 years, the Thungal family had come to terms with the loss. Unknown to them, Sajid had survived. He hadn't been on the flight and continued to try to work in the Gulf, determined to make a success of himself. He was worried about what his family would think if they discovered that he hadn't made his fortune there. When it was clear that it wasn't working out, he moved back to India, living in the city that was then still called Bombay. He ran a handful of businesses, but again couldn't find any success. In the end, he had to work multiple odd jobs to make ends meet. Sajid wanted to see his family again, but thought that they would be ashamed of him for his failed businesses. He was mentally unwell, having had to deal with the tragedy of the 76 plane crash without any support. This, as well as his struggling businesses, left him depressed, filled with survivor's guilt, and dealing with alcohol problems. In 2019, he was physically unwell too, as well as destitute. He was taken to a shelter where he was looked after, and a pastor named K.M. Phillip looked after him. With Pastor Phillip, Sajid worked through his problems and eventually opened up about the family he had left behind. The pastor was able to get in touch with the religious leader from Sajid's hometown who knew the family. In 2021, after 45 years away, he was finally reunited with his family. His father had since passed away, but the rest of his family were overjoyed to see him again. Far from being ashamed, they wanted to celebrate Sajid returning home and weren't going to let him out of their sight again. For decades, police in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, believed Betsy Langen had passed away. Betsy had been running away from a youth home named Talbot Hall. She was in her late teens and, according to a family member, had a problem with illegal substances at the time. Being one of 7 children, her mother had found it difficult to cope with Betsy, especially as one of her siblings was extremely ill. So when Betsy ran away from home, it was assumed that she'd gone away to start her own life away from the family that she'd already fallen out of touch with. Then, in October of 1973, a body was found in a wooded area in nearby Jonestown. She had been carelessly covered with a tarp and leaves. The young woman was found without any clothing or jewelry or identification. Police released sketches as they tried to find out who she was, but nobody came forward. They then started to look at missing person cases that matched the Jane Doe's description. 4 runaways were among those listed. 3 were ruled out, but Betsy could never be confirmed. DNA, Social Security activities, and interviews had all been used to rule out other possible identities for the Doe, but none of that was available for Betsy. Police were able to locate her, and there was nothing to say that the doe wasn't Betsy. They also couldn't confirm it was, though. The case went cold. Not only could they not identify who the woman was, they couldn't figure out who had taken her life. In 2015, the case was picked up again. A new bust of the woman was created, showing what she may have looked like in life, and it was revealed at a press conference. As well as the details of where and how the doe was found, police said that they believed she may have been Betsy. This was a shock to one family watching at home, especially a 26-year-old man who knew Betsy as his own mother. Betsy and her family had no idea she was still considered missing, as her mother had been preoccupied looking after her sick brother at the time. It seemed likely that it wasn't the Langen family, but the home that reported her missing. So when Betsy got her life back on track and got back in touch with her family, the information wasn't passed on to the home, and nobody confirmed Betsy was no longer missing. She married in 1980, taking her husband's surname, and making it harder for police to track her down. After the appeal, the family confirmed to police that Betsy had been found and was not the Jane Doe. Who the young woman is remains a mystery. For decades, China has had a serious problem with children being kidnapped to be raised by other families. In 1997, the Guo family in Shandong became victims of this terrible industry. Guo Xinjin was 2 years old and playing outside his home when an unfamiliar woman approached him. The woman snatched away the toddler and fled the scene before his parents could stop her. Xinjin's father, Guo Gangtang, began a 2-decade journey to bring his son home. Gangtang claimed that he did not feel like a father until he hit the road and began searching for his son. For 24 years, he traveled around China on a motorbike. He had little with him. All his life savings had gone into the campaign to find Xinjin, and he didn't have any luxuries as he traveled more than 300,000 miles to look for him. He took flyers and carried a flag with his son's picture, even though every year the man he was now looking for looked less and less like the toddler that had disappeared. The journey cost him physically, as Gangtang had a number of road traffic accidents and went through 10 motorbikes over the course of 2.5 decades. But it did inspire others to his cause. His fight to find Xinjin inspired a film, Lost and Love. When social media was introduced to China, Gangtang set up a website to try to help people find their missing children. Through the website and his other work, Gangtang helped more than 100 families reunite with their missing children. But it would be the work of police that led to Xinjin being found. There had been little DNA evidence at the scene of the crime, but it wasn't enough for investigators to make any progress back in 1997. But as technology advanced, police had more tools to try to locate the missing person. Using facial recognition technology, as well as advancements in DNA technology, a 26-year-old teacher from the nearby Henan province was identified as a potential match for Xinjin. After taking a DNA sample from the man, they confirmed that this was the missing person. Xinjin was finally reunited with his family in an emotional event, while the 2 people that kidnapped him were arrested. A woman identified as Tang was the one who took him from in front of his house. She met up with her then boyfriend, Hu, and went to sell him to a family. Gangtang said that he felt like the couple who had raised his son were now like relatives to him, and just seemed happy for the missing person case to finally be solved. Most missing children cases tend to be cases of non-custodial parental kidnapping. It occurs after a family splits apart and a court awards custody to one parent. The other parent decides for one reason or another to go against the court and take the child away. This was what happened to Savannah Todd in 1994. Savannah was born in May of 1993 to Dorothy Lee Barnett and Benjamin Harris Todd. By the time she was born, her parents had already split up. The romance between Dorothy and Benjamin had begun in 1990. It was rocky, from the outside looking good, but Benjamin struggled to deal with Dorothy's mood swings and her alleged mental problems. They married in 1991, but things only got worse. and in October of '93, Benjamin left. 6 months before Savannah was born, the couple officially divorced. Benjamin worried about Savannah's safety with her mother. He thought her outbursts would put Savannah in danger. He went to court to get full custody of his daughter. Dorothy tried to claim she was in good mental health, and psychiatrists deemed her mentally fit, but court-employed psychiatrists said otherwise. The judge awarded Benjamin custody and Dorothy visitation rights. It wasn't a situation Dorothy was happy with. Almost immediately, she got her hands on a fake birth certificate for herself and got IDs in this other name. Then in April of 1994, she took Savannah for her visitation and didn't come back. With the help of a family friend, she fled the country, first to Africa, where she met a man she would later marry, and later to New Zealand, and finally Australia. Meanwhile, Benjamin was doing everything he could to get his daughter back. He spent all of his savings on publicity for the case, which was even covered on Unsolved Mysteries. There were a number of sightings, but none of them led to Savannah being found. Finally, in 2013, he got an unexpected email. A woman living in Australia claimed she'd known Savannah and Dorothy for 12 years. They went by the names Samantha and Alex. But when she shared a photo of them, Benjamin was certain that it was his daughter and his ex-wife. Authorities finally caught up with Dorothy at the end of the year, and she was arrested. Savannah had grown up thinking her name was Samantha, and that Dorothy's second husband was her biological father. She supported her mother even after Dorothy was imprisoned for kidnapping and fraud, but did contact Benjamin again. She claimed she had a good, normal childhood and continues to live in Australia. After more than 40 years, a family was able to be reunited with their mother after she was located living in a care home in Fort Worth, Texas. Janice Rose Bullock disappeared sometime in late 1977, leaving behind 4 children. It was a messy situation, and she wasn't even officially reported missing for 40 years. However, when Janice was eventually found, another mystery revealed itself. Janice had already lost contact with her children by 1977. Her ex-husband had been awarded custody of her children in 1974, and according to some accounts, she never saw the children again. She was also apparently isolated from the rest of her family. The last time she made contact with them was in a letter in 1976. For decades, the last known address for Janice was in Pearl River County, Mississippi, in May of 1977. She had been issued a court summons, which she personally received. The date for her to appear in court was June 24th, but she never showed up. Whether she had already disappeared at this point, or if that came later, is unknown. But by the time her children were adults and began looking for their mother, this was where the trail went cold. Her daughter reported her missing in 2017 after years of searching. The case was passed around between police departments for a while, before authorities finally began to follow what little trail Janice had left. It was discovered that she'd been working at a truck stop around the time that she vanished. Regulars and staff from 1977 were interviewed. Many said she had gone to New Orleans, but that was all. However, one woman who claimed she had worked with Janice said that it was Raceland, Louisiana, not New Orleans, that Janice had moved to, and gave officers the name of a bar where Janice had worked. The investigation moved to Louisiana. Again, previous staff members at the bar were interviewed and confirmed that Janice had worked there, but they had no idea what had happened to her after she left. The last confirmed sighting authorities had was still decades old, but they kept publicizing the case, hoping that someone with information might come forward. Finally, after a social media post, another piece of vital information came out. This time, the tipster knew someone who'd been very close to Janice. Her husband. The man believed to be Janice's second husband had already passed away, but the tipster was able to put authorities in touch with a son that the couple had had together. The son, David, shared old family photos with authorities and revealed the woman he knew as his mother was in a nursing home. Police caught up with the elderly woman, who was now 71, and confirmed that this was Janice Bullock. But the revelation also led to another discovery. David wasn't the half-brother of Janice's 4 children. He had been sold to Janice and her husband as a child, and is now searching for his own biological family. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.